Eleanor had never been one for dramatic displays or grand moments under flashing lights, preferring quiet mornings in the countryside and the soothing rhythm of a kettle beginning to boil. But something about this morning felt unusually charged, with energy, as though the wind itself carried a secret it was aching to tell. And as she sat on the garden bench of the old stone cottage she and James had recently moved into, a hand pressed gently to the swell of her belly, she noticed how the sunlight danced differently through the trees, and how James, her partner of 4 years, had been humming softly in the kitchen, a tune she couldn't place, something unfamiliar and careful, like someone trying not to forget the words. And when he finally came outside, carrying 2 mugs of tea, hers with honey and a dash of milk, just how she liked it, he looked at her in a way that made her heart flutter, despite the nausea and swelling ankles, and she smiled because she already knew something was coming, though she didn't want to ruin it by saying so. So instead, she took the mug, their fingers brushing, and said nothing as he sat beside her, his free hand reaching instinctively for her belly, which had begun to move more regularly now, the tiny flutters becoming unmistakable kicks, and they both stilled, like they always did when the baby moved, as though to miss even a second of it would be unthinkable. And then he laughed softly and said, "I've been thinking about names again." And she rolled her eyes in mock exasperation, because they had gone through at least 20 names last week alone and hadn't agreed on a single one. Not really. And yet it was all part of the rhythm they were building. This dance between them that had deepened since the moment they saw those 2 faint pink lines on the bathroom counter, the moment that turned their world soft and sharp all at once. And now, as the garden bloomed around them with early spring daffodils and the faint promise of warmth, James set down his mug, stood suddenly, and then knelt, not on one knee, but both, right in the damp grass, and Eleanor blinked because he wasn't holding anything, not a ring, not a box, just his hands, open and honest in his lap. And when he spoke, it wasn't rehearsed, wasn't rhymed or clever, but it was his voice, and that was enough. I don't have a diamond, not yet, and I don't have a perfect speech, but I have this, us, this baby, this home, and everything I know about love, which is mostly what you've taught me these past 4 years. And I want to spend the rest of my life learning more of it with you, if you'll let me. And she didn't cry right away, not because it wasn't perfect, but because it was too much, too real. And she was suddenly reminded of the first time he had held her hand on a bridge in Bath, how his thumb had traced tiny circles on her knuckles, like a promise he hadn't spoken yet, and now here he was, making it with nothing more than the truth in his eyes and the hope in his voice. And she set her tea down, leaned forward awkwardly with the weight of their child between them, and kissed him like she hadn't kissed him in weeks, like it was the first time all over again, then whispered, "Yes, of course yes," against his cheek, her voice thick with the tears that finally came. And he laughed, wrapping his arms around her as they sat in the wet grass, uncaring of the cold or the mud. And she whispered again, "Yes, yes, yes," like a heartbeat. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the sleepless nights ahead, not the names still undecided, not the tiny fears that lived in the back of their minds about being good enough, or ready enough, or strong enough, because they had each other, and now they had a future they had chosen, a future they would build together, one quiet, beautiful day at a time. Wonderful! Here is part 2 of the story, continuing the journey of Eleanor and James, still in one flowing paragraph, carrying the emotional tone and style from part 1. This part moves forward with the aftermath of the engagement and deepens their bond as they prepare for their child. Later that same evening, after the sun had dipped behind the low hills and painted the sky in layers of lavender and peach, Eleanor found herself standing barefoot in the kitchen, one hand on her belly, the other absent-mindedly stirring a pot of lentil stew as James fussed behind her with candles, determined to make the evening feel like something more than just a proposal, as if their lives hadn't already shifted with the words they'd exchanged in the garden. And though they both wore old jumpers, and their cottage still smelled faintly of paint from the nursery they'd been working on, there was a golden glow in the room that made everything feel gently magical, and James, who normally didn't care much for small rituals, had laid the table with an almost reverent care, using the mismatched china they'd found at a market in Devon, and even folding the napkins, poorly but sweetly. And when they finally sat down to eat, knees bumping under the table, the silence between them was warm and full, not awkward, but alive, like a pause between verses of a song they both knew by heart, and they ate slowly, sharing looks and soft jokes, Eleanor catching James staring at her every few minutes with a quiet awe that made her cheeks flush. And after the dishes were washed and the candles burned low, they settled into the couch, the baby kicking gently now, like it too was content with the world. And James reached for Eleanor's hand, turning it over to press a kiss into her palm, whispering that he would find her a ring, a proper one, something lovely and worthy of her. But she only laughed and said she already had everything she wanted, and for the first time in days, the weight she had carried, the fear of not being enough, the worry that something would go wrong, the quiet grief that sometimes lingered from a past loss they rarely spoke of, lifted, not entirely, but just enough for her to breathe a little deeper, and James, sensing the shift, gently placed his head against her belly and began to hum again, the same tune from the morning, which she now recognized as an old lullaby his mum used to sing, and they stayed like that for what felt like hours, tangled in each other and the soft ticking of the old kitchen clock, until Eleanor, drowsy and safe, whispered that maybe they should get married before the baby came. Something simple, nothing grand, just the two of them, and maybe a few people they loved. And James nodded against her, saying he had already thought of that, had been imagining her in something soft and white, maybe barefoot in the orchard behind the cottage when the trees started to blossom. And Eleanor laughed again, the sound light and full of something she hadn't felt in months, pure joy, unshadowed. And as the wind picked up outside and the fire crackled low, they talked about everything and nothing, about wedding vows and middle names, about the little wooden cradle James's grandfather had once made that they'd found in the attic. And as the night deepened and their hands stayed linked, they both realized, wordlessly but completely, that this life, this moment, this shared heartbeat between them and the child they'd created was the kind of love they had never dared to hope for, but somehow, wonderfully, had found. Months later, beneath blooming apple trees, Eleanor and James exchanged vows with sunlight on their faces and their newborn cradled between them. No diamonds, no grandeur, just love, quiet and unwavering. As their baby stirred in sleep, they smiled, knowing their simple life was everything they'd ever dreamed, and more than enough.